Taiwan ranked #1 in Asia and 14th globally in the latest Human Freedom Index, jointly published by the Cato Institute in the US and Fraser Institute in Canada. It was ranked among the world's most progressive democratic nations, alongside Scandinavia, the freest smaller European nations, and New Zealand and Canada. Today, we look at why Taiwan has ranked so high in freedom, despite rising intimidation from and also being next to its authoritarian neighbor, China. Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks, covering the latest global news and analysis from a Taiwan perspective. I'm Betty Chen.
I'm Rath Wang. Coming up on our show today, the global average in the Human Freedom Index dropped significantly in 2020 to a 20-year low, affecting over 94% of the world's population. We look at how Taiwan did in these rankings and how it compares to other countries in the region. Then we hear from William Stanton, former de facto U.S. ambassador to Taiwan as the director of the American Institute in Taiwan, currently chair professor at National Zhengzhi University, on why Taiwan ranks so high on the Human Freedom Index.
There's a lively contest between political parties. The U.S. still hasn't had a woman president, but Taiwan has. A large percentage, much larger than the U.S., number of women are representatives in the legislature. Just the fact that Taiwan has embraced the idea that people should have personal choice with regard to their partners, whether they're gay or they're straight or whatever. They're free to marry who they want.
We will then discuss the rapid deteriorations of freedom in Hong Kong from encroachments of the Chinese Communist Party and what that means for neighboring Taiwan as it stands on the front lines in battling creeping authoritarianism. We also hear from Christina Hu, Director of Civic Engagement at Taiwanese American Citizens League, on why Taiwan's democratic progress is deeply linked to the growing Taiwanese identity in the United States and how gun violence is taking a toll on that growing identity.
Democratizing Taiwan in the 90s and then looking at the peaceful transition of power in 2000, 2008, 2016. And then think about like the Sunflower Movement, watching that abroad, and then also watching the Marriage Equality Act and seeing how democracy at work in Taiwan, how the progress is making. It's just building so much pride for Taiwanese Americans abroad.
Lastly, we discussed the growing Taiwanese identity, including one of Taiwan's largest diasporas, the United States, one that is distinct from a pan-ethnic, pan-cultural Chinese identity, and the violent reaction from those who identify otherwise, including mass shootings.
Welcome to the show. Joining us in a studio to discuss this today is Lai Yizhong, president of the Prospect Foundation, former Taiwanese diplomat in both Japan and the U.S., expert in Taiwan, U.S., Japan, China relations, and Yan Zhensheng, National Zhengzhi University professor of political science, who is also an expert in Taiwan, U.S., China relations. A warm welcome back to both President Lai and Professor Yan.
I spoke earlier to William Stanton, former de facto U.S. ambassador to Taiwan as the director of the American Institute in Taiwan. Ambassador Stanton is a seasoned former U.S. diplomat with extensive posts in the region as the deputy chief of mission of the U.S. embassies in South Korea and Australia. I also spoke earlier to Christina Hu, director of civic engagement at Taiwanese American Citizens League, who was a prominent voice among the Taiwanese American political activist community. She was also a leader in the Count All Taiwanese campaign to encourage U.S. residents of Taiwanese heritage to write in Taiwanese, not to tick Chinese in the ethnicity box in the U.S. population census survey. Let's now talk about how Taiwan scored the highest in Asia's in this year's Human Freedom Index. Taiwan scored 8.44, ranking 14th globally, with personal freedom at 8.98, the 12th highest in the world. This puts Taiwan on par with the most liberal nations, mainly smaller progressive countries in Europe and Oceania. President Lai, wanted to ask you, our first question is on why Taiwan has got this recognition and what brought Taiwan to take this top spot in Asia.
Yeah, you beat me, and because we're also trying to struggle, trying to understand ourselves. I think if you look at the charts about the democratic index, the tendency, especially after year 2018. In almost all areas, they are going down, and Taiwan is no exception. But I think that due to the foundation and what we did in the past, that already make us very high. So that even though we experience some dip in terms of the quality of democracy, but in comparison with other parts of the whole world, we are still in the top notches in terms of the ranking. But I will say that one of the reasons for Taiwan to be able to rank high, despite we constantly feel the threat from China, usually what the traditional conventional wisdom is that when a country facing a very strong external threat, usually the freedom of the individual freedom, political freedom, all those kind of things will go downhill as well, because the state will need to consolidate a lot of power to itself in order to fend against an external threat. But I think in Taiwan, one of the issues about how to tell the difference between China and Taiwan is that Taiwan is a democracy, and it has been consistently held, not just by the leader of Taiwan, but also the civil society in Taiwan, that in order to differentiate Taiwan from China, and also in order to disprove Chinese assertion that Taiwan is a part of China, or China's assertion that the democracy cannot fit for the Chinese nation, we had to be more democratic in order to prove them wrong. So I think that probably that is one of the hidden inspiration among the political activists and the politicians, that this is the line that just cannot be crossed. And we have to preserve that in order to show the differences. Another thing is that about the Taiwan democratizations, the dynamics, the civil society, their initiative is a very important part of it in order to move Taiwan toward the democracy. And we see that over 40 years of the martial law, that did not prevent people seeking for freedom. And many of the democracies actually engineered by the activists through their sacrifice in order to propel the whole society and the state into the democratizations. And that dynamics initiate and rooted deep in this society itself would not be suppressed or be in the regression whoever is the leader of Taiwan. And I think that is another important causes that Taiwan is able to maintain the kind of the dynamics for the democracy, irrespective of the leader or the party in power, because the civil society will have a very strong check and balance against them. And that is one of the reasons, I believe.
We just talked about Taiwan has been performing extremely well in the index, but on the contrary, China ranked 152. So that is 138 places behind Taiwan. And also China is in part of the lowest quartile of freedom on the index. So what's the reason behind this difference? Professor, what do you think?
Okay, of course, I think President Lai already mentioned some reasons. I think, if we look at this human freedom, it is divided into two categories. One is personal freedom. The other one is economic freedom. And you have 7 subcategories for personal freedom, and then 5 for economic freedom. We didn't do as well with the economic freedom part. We usually score in the 7, but we have done well in the personal freedom, especially religion, especially personal safety. We know we are all very safe to walk in the evening outside Taipei. And then also in terms of civil society, civil association, and also expression of information as well. The one thing I think Ambassador Stanton mentioned is that we call association, personal association, relationship. Means different kinds of marriage, status, and also inheritance rights, which we score 10 out of 10. And also female genital mutilation, we don't have that practice, so 10. The only one we were below 8 here is divorce. I think maybe the procedure is not as friendly to some parts, I don't know. But usually, if you look at, of course, if you look at China, they don't have personal freedom, in terms of freedom of assembly, right? That's the biggest threat to China. They don't have freedom of religion, which will get them way down there, because you only can have some churches, either Buddhist, either Catholic or Christian church, sanctioned by the state, so-called the three self churches. So that's, I think, just compared to those. And then I think, people with, I think, different sexual orientation is not protected in China. So you look at all this, that's already, we are way ahead, right? So the others, economic parts as well. China has a lot of state enterprises. China has a lot of this we call control over the economy. We are not as good as we want, but much better than China in both categories. So in that sense, our higher ranking is because of our personal freedom or personal compared to economic freedom. Economic freedom, we need to do more, especially in terms of regulation part, in terms of tariff and other stuff. But still, overall, I think, if you rank number one in Asia, ahead of Japan, ahead of Korea, used to be Hong Kong was very high before it was taken over, and the first few years was okay, but now it's very low. And then Singapore, you have a big problem of not a lot of, democratic competition there. So that's why I think it is natural. I think you compare the Asian country, we should be ranked number one here.
Thank you.
Also, a lot of them state enterprises in Singapore. But going back to China, what is this push that we've recently seen with the Chinese government going into companies, state-owned and also private-owned, to curb their influence or either to take over these companies?
Well, you think about this. Before you have the private enterprises, in every so-called danwei workplace, the Communist Party has control, has a secretary there overseeing everything. And even so, when you're coming into the private enterprises, their role is not as conspicuous as before. And I think government felt that is a loophole in their control system. So they want to have more say in the state, converting or encouraging greater state enterprise involvement and kind of squeeze out the private enterprises.
So that's what has led to this current wave of control, or increased control. Japan came in close to Taiwan as the second freest country in Asia. It ranked 16 in the Human Freedom Index. Japan is also often cited as Taiwan's most important relationship in the region. Both countries also rank close in both personal and economic freedom. President, I wanted to ask you, as a former diplomat in Japan representing Taiwan, how do you feel this relationship, this bilateral relationship between Taiwan and Japan can further in terms of freedom and also this common adversary or competitor of China?
I think the Japan and Taiwan relation is complicated, not just because that the Japan has ruled Taiwan for about 50 years. Taiwan was a colony of Japan, but also due to the Japan's invasion of China and the influx of the Taiwan of the Chinese immigrants after 1949. So in Taiwan, there's actually two different groups and two different historical memories about what's happening from before the 1945. A big group of the citizens in Taiwan, they were part of Japan. They were Japan citizens, and some of them even joined Japan Imperial Army for their campaign in South Pacific as well as in Southeast Asia. But also, we have the Chinese immigrants coming to Taiwan after 1949, that they've been invaded by Japan. So that in terms of how the Taiwan-Japan relation already within Taiwan, there's this composition of the conflicting historical memories due to different groups. And so that makes the relation with Japan, especially when we talk about the history, that becomes a very toxic issue or very controversial issues. And then that basically is when we look at how the Taiwan-Japan relations, in order to conquer that kind of complication within Taiwan, the new development is actually work on what will be the common things between Taiwan and Japan, in addition to the so-called the security threat from whether that's China or other countries. And in this regard, the democracy and the common value of political freedom, that becomes a very important glue for the Taiwan and Japan. For Taiwan, of course, when Taiwan was in a martial law all the way until 1987, and then we pushed forward for the democracy, and Japan's civil society was the first one started to recognize about what's Taiwan development. If you look at the foreign presence in Taiwan, before year 2001 or year 2002, the biggest group of the foreign press presence in Taiwan is actually Japan. They have a lot of the major newspapers, they send their correspondent to Taiwan to cover the local news. And the news they cover not just about the political or cross-strait relationship, and basically that means war, but a lot of the cultural as well as the historical memories and many different things. So that they started to bring about the appreciation of Taiwan's past and what Taiwan civil society is all about to the Japan audience. Another thing about, for Japan, what Japan discovered, especially after the year 2000 in Taiwan, is that due to for a long period of time, from 1950 all the way to 1989 or 1990s, Japan was a long democracy in East Asia. If you look at it, that yes, Taiwan has a martial law from 1947 to 1987, and Korea walked out of the martial law after 1987. But during that time, that Japan was a lone democracy. So Japan felt very lonely. And when Korea became democratized, their relationship with Japan before the 1945 becomes one of the driving forces for the Korea-Japan relations. But in Taiwan, when Taiwan became democratized, that Taiwan started to appreciate more about what the current Japan is. So Japan feels that the kind of democracy not only is a common value bound between Taiwan and Japan, but also gave Japan a sense of acceptance. Especially after the post-Cold War era, that Japan's as a lone democratic country in the East Asia, and due to the past history of the invasions, they need to be recognized as this a normal state. They need to be accepted, and Taiwan provide them the kind of recognition.
So all in all, it's democracy that actually bonded the two nations.
That's right, that's right.
So thank you, President, for talking about the relations between freedom and democracy, and we will talk about that later. We just spoke about the reasons why Taiwan ranks so high in human freedom, taking the top spot in Asia, the striking contrast the nation draws with its authoritarian neighbor, China, and how Taiwan can work with other allies in a region to remain free. Coming up next, we will be hearing from William Stanton, former American Institute of Taiwan AIT director, on why the nation's high ranking on the Human Freedom Index doesn't come as a surprise.
Let's now hear from William Stanton, former de facto U.S. ambassador to Taiwan, in his role as the director of the American Institute in Taiwan. Ambassador Stanton is a seasoned former U.S. diplomat and also served as the deputy chief of mission of the U.S. embassies in South Korea and Australia. The ambassador spoke to me about Taiwan's democratic progress and the strong link it has with freedom. Let's take a look.
Taiwan ranks globally in so many perspectives, whether in terms of the success of its healthcare system, its ability to deal with pandemics, its safety and crime record, very safe place. If you look at its economic accomplishments, it's usually very high in terms of both nominal GDP and per capita GDP. Its success in science and technology, its trading relationships. I think it's varied between being the 8th and the 11th largest trading partner of the United States, for example. So the purpose of all that is Taiwanese are often self-effacing. When I saw the Human Index report and Taiwan had ranked 14th, it wasn't a surprise. It's sort of an inevitability, particularly when you look at the way the Freedom Index is set up. it first gives you points for personal freedoms, and just the fact that Taiwan has embraced the idea that people should have personal choice with regard to their partners, whether they're gay or they're straight or whatever. They're free to marry who they want. Uh, that kind of personal freedom. The fact that, the US still hasn't had a woman president, but Taiwan has. Um, a large percentage, much larger than the US, number of women are representatives in the legislature. So there's no surprise there in terms of freedom of expression, freedom to say what you think. There's no restrictions on that. And then the political freedoms, there's a lively contest between political parties. I've lived in, for example, South Korea, which, I think ranked 30th as opposed to Taiwan's 14th ranking. And I can see why, perhaps, because there's a little bit less going for South Korea in terms of political freedom. There seems to be a little bit more restrictions. It's not as wide open. It tends to be dominated, pretty much by whichever party comes to power. But Taiwan is just a much more open place, and people express all kinds of views. And Taiwan ranks overall very highly in almost every category I can think of on a global basis. And in a way, it's surprising that it comes out, just following actually most of the countries that rank very highly in freedom indexes are in fact the Scandinavian countries, the small European countries, New Zealand, countries that are relatively small, racially homogeneous in general, countries like Finland and Sweden and Norway, Estonia, Switzerland.
As a former US ambassador and diplomat, how does this compare with the US, another democracy?
But it's also no surprise to me that the US didn't rank that highly, given the deep political divisions we see in the United States, the terrible, since safety and security are one of the points for personal freedom. There's an awful lot of crime still in America. There's an awful lot of violence. There's a lack of gun laws. So you see a lot of problems in the United States that you don't see in Taiwan. So when my daughters have visited Taiwan and they'd go out at night, to clubs, I never worried about them.
Ambassador, the report also mentions a strong link between freedom and democracy. How do you see that in terms of reflecting in Taiwan's high ranking?
There's lively debates between the two major political parties, but now in recent years, there's also two other parties that have come up, more minor support, but also gaining some popular support. So there's a continuing lively debate among all the parties, really, about the direction of the government, about policies. It's a very healthy debate. There are newspapers reflecting different points of view. There are dialogues that take place in think tanks, in newspapers, on television between people who have different views. Taiwan Plus itself is noted for its discussions between people from different parties with very different views. What's even more remarkable in my mind is that given the threat that the PRC represents to Taiwan, because of their continuing threatening words, threats against Taiwan, nonetheless, you see people speaking up and saying, well, we need a more conciliatory policy with regard to China. That frankly surprises me and frightens me a bit. But on the other hand, it shows that it's really, an open society and people can express their views. And as I say, it's not so common these days in the United States to see Republicans and Democrats debating in the same venue. they tend to get on their own channels, one kind or another. So the Republicans are on Fox News, and you'll see, the Democrats on MSNBC. They have different channels that they operate in. Less often are they engaging with one another on the same media.
So, Ambassador, does this strike contrast with China?
The biggest outpouring of popular opposition to the government came some weeks ago when people went into the streets and protested against the COVID policy. Subsequently, we've heard that using facial recognition software, these people were pursued, and many of them have wound up being locked up. It was a signal once again that an authoritarian government, you cannot disagree with the government, even on an issue which really affects people's personal lives so deeply, like healthcare, the best means to fight disease. If you disagree with a government policy which did a 180-degree change of direction from going to a total lockdown to suddenly, without any warning, opening up to everyone, and it's no surprise for me, therefore, that China ranks so low in the freedom reports.
Does that affect the well-being of Chinese citizens?
Absolutely, it affects the well-being of people because they can't pursue policies as groups about, what's in the best health interests of the Chinese people. They can't say, well, look, this is what some other countries have tried and it's working there. Why can't we try that as well? It's a dictatorship from one man at the top who decides what the policy is going to be, and then he enforces it. And there's nobody who can say no. This has effect not only on the population, the health of the population of China, but the health of the world.
You just heard Ambassador Stanton speak to Rath about how democracy is inextricably linked to human freedom and the dire effects authoritarians can have on people's well-being, as seen recently with how China opened up. Let's now talk more about the effect of that. Comparisons are often drawn between Taiwan and Hong Kong. Once ranked third highest in the world, it has now dropped to 34. The index report cited the Chinese Communist Party's increasing interference in the city's affairs as the #1 factor and expects it to further slide in the future, with the party's infringement on freedom effectively ending Hong Kong's autonomous status under the one country, two systems model. So my question for you, Professor, what message does China's interference in Hong Kong and destruction of its high degree of freedom send to the world?
Well, I think, this is how China lost the confidence of Taiwanese people by offering a so-called one country, two system to Hong Kong. And Taiwanese are looking at this one and saying, you are also talking about one country and two system for Taiwan. You said 50 years for Hong Kong, no change. But then only some 20 years later, we found out all this change. And so I think it is a slap of Deng Xiaoping, who come up with this idea and then being discredited by his own party. That Hong Kong traditionally, we know that, yes, Hong Kong was a very free place. Maybe under the British rule, you don't have the right to vote, you don't have so-called political freedom, but economic freedom is always there. And then after, British handed over in 1984, there was a design for indirect election of the governor and gradual, opening up of the political space. What China was arguing at the time, I think, is saying, we will allow, the British, political structure continue, but it didn't recognize that there will be this kind of transformation among the Hong Kongese people, just like earlier, someone mentioned about Taiwan identity. I think Hong Kong also, develop a Hong Kong identity, which is not allowed in China. I think that's the biggest problem. Is how can how Hong Kong develop an a separate identity that might challenge, the Chineseness of the Hong Kong, and then, which also will, have an implication for Taiwan as well. So I think that's the reason the Beijing authority decided to take a harsh position.
Given China's drive for total control, as the professor mentioned in Hong Kong, we also see that, of course, in Taiwan. And because of that, the U.S. is amping its support for Taiwan, as we've seen with the bases in the Philippines, where the U.S. is expanding its presence and also capabilities. How do you see that in terms of helping Taiwan to defend and deter a Chinese invasion?
I think the U.S. support, whether that's increasing the bases in the Philippines and also improve the U.S.-Japan alliance for coordination on the issue of the Chinese invasion against Taiwan, as well as others, military assistance to Taiwan and training, those are definitely the very helpful step for bolster Taiwan's defense against possible Chinese invasion. But I think in addition to those military hardware assistance, another very important thing is about the U.S. Alerting other countries internationally about the possible Chinese threat to Taiwan. And not just about military threat, but also the Chinese insistence on elimination of Taiwan's international existence. And that is another very important aspect of the Chinese campaign against Taiwan. And also that could be very demoralizing if Taiwan in international space or our international existence will continue facing threat or even eliminated by China one by one. And we are glad that the United States right now is paying very much more attention to the development. Because for Taiwan, especially in the post-Cold War era, the globalizations, the interconnected of the whole world is so critical for the economic, cultural, and social development of Taiwan. And then the elimination of Taiwan's international presence and also Taiwan's participation for the global affairs in all kinds of international gatherings. If Taiwan does not have the ticket or opportunity to participate, the endurance of the society to sustain its presence will be under severe threat. And that also will lead to a demoralization about the citizens in Taiwan that no matter what we do, and no matter what kind of democracy we're advancing internationally, no one will recognize us. And that will result to either the exodus of the talented people for their own future, or the problem about the continued phase of democracies. And so I think that this support for Taiwan of international presence is very important, and which is also a very important part of U.S. assistance to Taiwan. We just cannot overlook that.
President, do you feel that this support will actually increase with the Chinese spy balloon incident? Do you feel that that serves as a wake-up call for the U.S. to boost support for democracy here?
Well, I think the balloonings, the Chinese balloon itself, in terms of the military or the intelligence community, they understand what this is and what it can do, what it cannot do. But the balloon itself is such a big presence that visible in ordinary citizens' eyes. So it's sort of the metaphysical sense that this is real. And this threat is actually descending upon us. So when people look at that, it's a physical demonstrations about
visible,
China.
just right there.
Yeah, the Chinese threat. And so that brings up the whole society up to the speed about we should be conscious about this threat.
So this would mean that if military conflict happened in Taiwan with a Chinese invasion or some sort of military assault, the U.S. public would be more aware and more supportive, or could that be linked?
I do not know whether that would directly link to the U.S. support or the military engagement with China for the support of Taiwan. Because to the U.S. citizens, that probably means that we are going to send my sons, my husband, or my daughter, to the battlefield, and they will die for Taiwan. I think it would take a little bit extra for the U.S. citizens to consider that Taiwan is really that important part of our lives that we need to, we are willing to defend it, even sacrifice our own, my own kinships. Yeah.
Yeah, we will come back to that later. So we just discussed how authoritarianism poses a direct threat on human freedoms, a scene in Hong Kong with Chinese Communist Party encroachment, and how Taiwan is increasingly gaining support from fellow democracies around the world as the country sits on the front lines of the battle between democracy and authoritarianism. Coming up next, we'll be hearing from Christina Hu, Director of Civic Engagement at Taiwanese American Citizens League, on how the growing Taiwanese identity in the U.S. closely follows Taiwan's democratic progress in the past few decades.
Let's now hear from Christina Hu, Director of Civic Engagement at Taiwanese American Citizens League, who was also the leader in the Write in Taiwanese campaign, encouraging U.S. residents of Taiwanese heritage to write in Taiwanese and not ticking Chinese for ethnicity in the U.S. population census survey. She spoke to me about why Taiwan's democratic progress is deeply linked to the growing Taiwanese identity there, and how gun violence in the U.S. is taking a toll on that growing very identity. Let's take a look.
Within the Taiwanese American community around me, also because of the history and the progress that Taiwan has been making. Looking back at democratizing Taiwan in the 90s and then looking at the peaceful transition of power in 2000, 2008, 2016, and then think about like the Sunflower Movement, watching that abroad, and then also watching the Marriage Equality Act and seeing how democracy at work in Taiwan, how the progress is making. It's just building so much pride for Taiwanese Americans abroad. And of course, then when you think about your heritage and you're proud of it, then of course that coincides with increasing pride in Taiwanese American identity.
With this growing identity, there has also been hostility from those who identify as Chinese, as we've seen with the Laguna Woods incident at the Taiwan Presbyterian Church.
I just want to highlight the incident last May. It also happened during the Asian American Heritage Month too. And as Taiwanese, we also established the first week of May as Taiwanese Heritage celebration as well. So it's very poignant that it happened in May, but the shooter went to the church, a Presbyterian church, which had a long history in is part of the Taiwanese democracy movement too. So all these elements playing together, it was very, it would definitely influence and really impacted our community, and it was a great tragedy. And as part of the civic engagement director team at Taiwanese American Citizens League, that we wrote a statement, and I like to read part of it to highlight that day and why we chose the Taiwanese Strong as a hashtag, as a rallying point for us. So for the audience, it's choking me up a little bit. In the midst of the tragedy, we herald the bravery and quick thinking of Dr. Chen, the pastor, and the congregants who subdued the shooter and prevented the death of even more people. It is preserving that this sort of bravery should be even, it's perverse that this sort of bravery should even be necessary, but it is a statement to the selfless and strength of the Taiwanese people. And you think about how that identity being Taiwanese is so tied to democracy ideals now. And then you see the juxtaposition of Chinese identity. It really is a reminder how the courage and the legacy that we choose to follow could mean life and death sometimes.
Has this incident actually strengthened the Taiwanese American identity or the Taiwanese identity in the United States?
Yeah, it definitely did. I mean, the idea around Taiwanese Strong is a reminder of where we have been and the hope that we can continue to go toward. Even with the tragedy like this, that reminds us of what we're made of. We're from the legacy of people who choose courage and choose to do the right thing when it counts the most.
Speaking of gun violence, the U.S. has seen more than 60 mass shooting incidents since the start of the year, and that's only about over a month. Why is there so much gun violence, and what's the stark difference between the two democracies, Taiwan and the U.S.?
You have people who are saying gun control, which makes sense that because if you look at the statistics around the world, Americans, private citizens own twice the amount of guns per 100 people compared to the next country. But off and on, the wealth and the abundance in the United States actually exhibits in many forms, right? But also includes owning guns. But on the other hand, is that there is a lot of instability and inequality and probably a lot of lack of social safety net in the United States as well that is increasing, that's fomenting this need for people who actually want to commit this crime, and also mental health too. There is another segment in the statement from actually from last year during the shooting at the Presbyterian Church in May last year. So it's interesting to look at it historically. According to the Gun Violence Archive, the shooting in May 2002 of our community, this was the 201st mass shootings of 2022, and that was last year in May. So compared to this year, so we're on track. So out of 202 mass shootings as of the morning of May 16, 2022. And we wrote that this is a heartbreaking and staggering statistics, which no one wants to be part of. And it comes actually as a no surprise that it would eventually touch more closer to home, like last year in May, and then this year during the Lunar New Year celebration in Monterey Park. I'm sure audience in Taiwan has heard of that shooting. And then the subsequent 2 days later of another shooting in Northern California. And I'm sure people are paying attention because that's where a lot of Taiwanese live too. I look for Taiwan, and Taiwan's number is 0. In a lot of ways that Americans are still shocked, and I'm hoping that people are not going to be just thinking this is business as normal, and it's still waiting for a point of sort of a change in terms of general policy on guns, or a much larger scale of legislation or policy that can deal with this. But in the meantime, yeah, it's something to watch for, looking at how Congress or the government or policy-wise trying to balance this idea of the right to bear arms, your freedom to do so, versus the freedom to feel safe, versus the freedom to not be shot.
Do you feel there's room for change in this gun culture as it started, as you mentioned, it started with the founding of the United States?
It's a sweet spot when you think about how you can use different freedoms and make them not juxtapose each other, right? Because I suppose not everything in life is absolute, but there's a happy medium point that you're right to, there's always a tension, even in freedom of speech, in the First Amendment, that there is later on founding through the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court also interprets what the founding documents meant compared to the law. And so people sue when there's law that they think is not constitutional. That's what it means. And there's a founding document. And you think about how the right to bear arm is supposed to be something that is not infringing on other people. It really wears that sweet spot, then maybe it's more responsibility, right? And I joke a lot how that comic books can also be very quotable as well, as maybe not as highbrow as the Constitution, but you think about Spider-Man, great privilege comes with great responsibility. And it's the same thing here. If we enjoy certain freedom, it is some freedom, like it's intrinsic. We ought to have freedom, and we should allow individuals to flourish, and it's good for the society and it's good for human progress. But at the same time, that it comes with certain responsibility. So it's not exactly saying that is curbing a freedom, but it's treating the freedom with the respect that it deserves.
You just heard Christina Hu speak to Rath about how the progress in Taiwan's democratization is inextricably linked to the growing Taiwanese identity in the U.S. She also spoke about violence against the Taiwanese community there because of this growing identity and concerns around increasing U.S. gun violence. So before we go into guns, I would like to discuss the correlation between Taiwan's democratization and the strong and growing Taiwanese identity among the Taiwanese communities in the United States. So, President, I understand that you have played a very important role in the Taiwan-centric organizations that advocate for Taiwan's democratization. So, what is the main driving factors for the growing Taiwan identity among these people living in the U.S.?
I would say that the Taiwanese, the identity issue in the United States by Taiwanese American is basically an extension of the Taiwanese identity struggle within Taiwan. Many of the people in Taiwan, and then they migrate to the United States, but they still consider that they have a distinct identity of Taiwan on its own, rather than as part of Chinese. In the United States, they also wanted to be recognized as such, not as part of the so-called Chinese American. And so that while they were students in their campuses, they want to establish a Taiwanese Student Association rather than Chinese Student Association. And while the second generations in the United States, they wanted to be read as a Taiwanese American rather than Chinese American. So the identity part of it is important identifications about who they are, and also as the memory of where they're from. You're from Taiwan, you're Taiwanese, and then we're not from China, and we're not Chinese. So that is basically how the driving force at the primary stage there. But then, as Taiwan started to become democratic countries, and the struggle for within Taiwan is no longer about the Taiwanese identity, but the establishment of democracy. And one of the biggest differentiation between Taiwan and China, especially PRC, is about the democracy itself. So that democracy right now started to take a central stage about when we talk about Taiwanese identity, what's the content of it? And democracy started to become a very visible part. And that can be distinguished between Taiwan and China. And so that in the United States, for the Taiwanese American, the identity issues also become, when people ask them what exactly you are talking about, the Taiwanese identity, that's so important. And they'll point out, look, the democracy in Taiwan, and also how that can propel the Taiwanese American civil rights movement in the United States.
We just discussed how Taiwan is ranked the highest in Asia in the Human Freedom Index and how democracy and freedom are directly linked. Let us know in the YouTube comment section if you believe Taiwan's democratic progress is directly linked to the growing Taiwanese identity in Taiwanese overseas communities worldwide, as we've heard from in the US, and how the Taiwanese identity is ever more distinct and diverging from a pan-ethnic, pan-cultural Chinese identity. Also, if you like our shows, please subscribe to the Taiwan Talks YouTube channel at Taiwan Talks 2022.
Thank you for watching our show today. Stay safe and see you next time.